Go to Devon's Road in London in Bromley-by-Bow and you'll find a pub with a net of hot cross buns hanging above the bar. I know it's pretty weird even for a pub, but a legend has grown up around the Widow's Son, the pub in question. Every year, a sailor arrives on Good Friday and places a hot cross bun in the nets over the bar. But why on earth would somebody do that? Let's find out in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are rattling along with the folklore of food, as I assumed that we would really this month. And because we've kind of gone down a slightly different track of almost baked goods, and I know we might go, oh, but you don't bake fruit, but you do put fruit in things like pies. So that's the tenuous link. So we are now moving on to a very specific type of baked good, which is hot cross buns. And I know that it's not Easter until next month. It's just the way that things have worked out. And I wanted to tell the story of the Widow's Son pub because it is so intrinsically linked with hot cross buns, but then we will also have a look at the history and folklore of hot cross buns as well. If you suddenly heard a weird crack noise while I was saying that, that was just my shoulder cracking. So yeah, we get sound effects in this episode as well apparently. I also wanted to point out that at the time of recording, it's actually Monday the 13th of March and I'm going down to London tomorrow with a work trip, which is why I'm doing the episode a bit earlier. And also Tuesday actually marks my birthday, so I just thought I'd mention that because there is a person behind the podcast. So that's another reason why I'm doing this hot cross buns post, just for logistical reasons. But anyway, let's get on with the episode. So I started out in the introduction by explaining the sort of legend around the Widow's Son pub in Bromley-by-Bow. But let's have a look at what actually occurs within this legend to have this tradition of putting a hot cross bun in the net above the bar. According to the story, a widow's house originally stood on the site now occupied by the pub. Her sailor son spent much of the year at sea, but one year she expected him home at Easter. He promised to return on Good Friday. So she baked him a hot cross bun and set it aside when he didn't return that day. Perhaps she expected him soon after. But her son didn't return that Easter. So the following year, she did the same thing. She baked a batch of hot cross buns and set one aside for her son. The custom continued, and every year she added another unclaimed bun to the pile. Her house became famous for the growing collection of hot cross buns. Some accounts name her as Mrs. Hart, and she apparently died in 1813. Meanwhile, another article named her as Mrs. Brodie, and according to one version of the legend, the sailor had actually written home in 1788 to ask her to save a bun for him. So if that's true, then obviously she kept saving hot cross buns for another 25 years, if we believe that she died in 1813. However, according to Tatler, the tradition dated to 1824. So the very fact that there's so many different versions of this and who she might be and when this was all happening does start to kind of make us think that perhaps the story isn't quite as true as it may appear. But in 1958, a sailor from Bow hung up the Good Friday bun and a London newspaper described the custom as being 134 years old at that point, and that concurs with the 1824 starting point named in Tatler, although the same article in the East End News and London Shipping Chronicle says the tradition began in 1884, which I'm assuming is a typo. But anyway, when the cottage was demolished and the pub was built in 1848, the owners named it the Widow's Son in honour of the story, and it's held the same name since at least 1851. Some descriptions even call it the Bun House or the Bun Shop. Now, the owners continued the custom by inviting in a sailor every year, and apparently it's even part of the lease now. Now, the tradition continued at least until 2012, with the Royal Navy now supplying the sailors, and 2012 was the last time I can find anyone actually writing a blog post specifically about the tradition. And the pub was almost demolished in 1966 when the GLC bid to buy the site, and plans were apparently made to move the hot cross buns to another pub if the Widow's Son was torn down. Now, the pub was closed in 2015 for potential redevelopment, and then this 2016 ceremony apparently took place at the Queen's Head in Limehouse, but the Widow's Son did reopen in 2017. I did have a look at their website to see if they were still doing the particular tradition or if it had continued or anything like that, but there doesn't seem to be any mention of it other than a single blog post from 2022, which is just a repost of the 2012 article from Spittlefield's Life. So, like I say, it is a bit difficult to find out if they do still do it or not. Now, like I said, it is difficult to tell if the legend is true. There's no real proof that the widow or her son actually existed. The widow's surname changes depending on the version of the story, which, like I say, doesn't help with veracity. But at this point, it doesn't really matter either way, because the tradition has gone on for so long now that it's become a tradition in its own right, regardless whether the origin story is true. And this is, of course, one of the funny little quirks of folklore. People can continue a tradition even when it's divorced from its origins, and then the act of continuing it sort of turns it into its own tradition as well. Now, obviously, that can be problematic depending on what the tradition is, but in this case, the tradition is building on older folklore about the magical properties of hot cross buns, which we will get to in a moment. Now, stories of setting aside baked goods on Good Friday are more common than you would think, as we saw in the Folklore of Bread episode, and people believed that buns baked on Good Friday would never turn mouldy, partly due to the magical effect of Good Friday itself, but also partly thanks to the cross on them. Christ's body showed no signs of decay after the crucifixion, hence no mould on hot cross buns. Now, people did also leave them to completely dry out, which I can't help thinking probably also slowed the decay process as well. So if you've got something that's got very little water content in it, obviously clearly there's less for the mould to actually grow with, if that makes any kind of sense. Now, people did claim to have eaten hot cross buns that were anywhere between 7 and 21 years old, which I personally think is foul, but there we go. But people would sometimes rebake them to soften them again, or sprinkle them with water, and that could apparently revive them. And that is a little bit of a tip, particularly for croissants. If they've gone a little bit dry, if you pop them in the oven and heat them up, they do actually go soft again, which is worth knowing. Now, Jacqueline Simpson notes that in Glossary of Words Used in the Neighbourhood of Whitby, F.K. Robinson describes seeing Good Friday biscuits hanging from a ceiling, and they actually had holes through them to aid with the suspension. So Simpson suggests that this is where the custom actually came from, and the widow's son story later grew up around the custom, which is entirely possible. So the tradition came first, and then a story came along with it to sort of explain it, and then it's kind of then become its own tradition as well. Now, the hot cross bun itself does have quite an interesting history, so I wanted to actually include a little bit of it here. And Thomas Rowcliffe is often credited as making the first hot cross bun in the 14th century near St Albans, while earlier civilisations, including the Greeks, Romans and Saxons, all used baked goods to mark each passing season. Brother Rowcliffe made the Alban bun specifically to mark Easter. Now, you do get all kinds of articles, like people claim that they were actually originally a Celtic deity and they were round to signify the moon, and the cross on them was actually to signify the equinoxes and solstices and blah this and blah that. Might I remind you, as always, the Celts wrote nothing down, and I'm not sure how we would possibly have any kind of evidence as to what the Celts baked, given baked goods' tendency to rot. So when you do see things like that written down, you do have to think, where did that come from? Did someone like the Romans actually write that down to note a tradition that they were continuing, or has someone just invented an ancient past for something, which is unfortunately quite common? Whereas we do know that these ones, the Alban buns for Easter, do date to the 14th century. The idea was that the monks would bake these buns and then hand them out to the local poor on Good Friday. The cross helped them to remind the recipients about the crucifixion, and they ultimately proved so popular that the concept then spread across the country. And by the 19th century, hot cross buns had then become a way to mark the end of Lent on Good Friday. Now, we don't know what exactly was put in the Alban bun because the recipe is still a secret, but we do know that they contained flour, eggs, yeast, currants and spices. Now, the cross was actually cut into the bun rather than being piped on, so when they rise, the top sort of splits open in quite a cool sort of way and gives you like an extra sort of crusty bit, as it were. And they do look quite nice, to be fair. And a local bakery does still make Alban buns using the original recipe, but only during Lent and Holy Week. And as the master baker points out, the cathedral once owned the mill that produced the Alban buns, so the bakery continuing to make them helps to reinvigorate the relationship between the two. Now, it's not immediately obvious when the Alban bun became the hot cross bun as we know it today, but Elizabeth I deemed hot cross buns so sacred that she actually banned their sale on any day that wasn't Good Friday, Christmas or a burial. People did make them at home, but if they were caught, they would have to give their illegally made hot cross buns to the poor. Although I will note that I have heard some commentators say that Elizabeth was basically trying to weaken the Catholic hold on England, and other commentators note Oliver Cromwell's attempts to ban hot cross buns as signs of religious fervour. Remember, Oliver Cromwell is the absolute epitome of the fun police, because he's tried to ban pretty much anything that went against the Puritan way of doing things. There was an almanac series in the 17th and 18th centuries called Poor Robin, and the 1733 edition captures the street cry, and I quote, "Good Friday comes this month, the old woman runs, with 1 up to a penny hot cross buns," end quote, which scholars consider to be the first clear written record of hot cross buns. Now, James Boswell recorded that he'd breakfasted with Samuel Johnson in 1773 on Good Friday and enjoyed cross buns, and their full name of hot cross buns seems to have only really appeared in the early 19th century because they were sold hot. So the hot cross buns in the 18th century street cry refers to their temperature rather than their actual name. So as in they were hot cross buns, if that makes sense. Now, in terms of their folklore, they are also quite interesting because people would eat hot cross buns for breakfast on Good Friday, and they were referred to as both cross buns and Good Friday buns. The custom dates to at least the early 19th century, although it is possible that it is even older. But the crumbs of such buns were supposedly a great cure for diarrhoea, and people would often make extra buns to set aside as medicine for the next 12 months. So essentially, you would take your bun, you would let it dry out again, because obviously you needed it to be dry so it wouldn't go mouldy, and you would hang on to it, and then if people had any kind of bowel or stomach disorders, you would grate the bun and then put the shavings in water or brandy and you would drink it. And this remedy was, according to various folk tales, apparently quite good at curing these disorders of the bowel or stomach. People might also keep one of the Good Friday buns for luck and hang them from their ceiling, and they would keep the bun hanging for a whole year and then replace it with a bun made the following Good Friday. Now obviously there are also some stories of people just keeping them up there for years, but the general idea was that you would replace it every Good Friday. Due to the cross on the top, they could apparently also banish evil spirits from the kitchen, and the buns were also believed to protect the house from fire. Now, I would debate the truth of that last one because the Widow's Son pub apparently caught fire in the 1980s. Other people said it was more towards the 90s, but either way, there was a fire and the buns apparently still bore signs of scorching. So I'm not entirely sure how well they do protect your home from fire, so you might want to just invest in a smoke alarm instead. Now, one woman in the Cambridgeshire Fens actually kept her Good Friday bread in a tin to bring her family good luck for the following year. So every year she would replace the old loaf with a new one. And then what she would do, once she'd obviously replaced them, she would moisten the old loaf, which let's remember was now a year old. She would rebake it and then eat it on Easter Day. And whoever got the part of the bread marked with the cross got special blessings. And the family would also throw the end slice of the loaf into the nearby river to protect the area from floods. And the thing I like about this particular story, which Ronald Hutton actually relates, is this idea that you've got several bits of folklore going on at the same time in this one custom. So you've got the custom of replacing the bread every year, obviously from Good Friday, and then eating it again on Easter Day like a year later. You've got the bread being marked with the cross, so that if you get the bit with the cross on it, you get extra blessings, which is a little bit like the kind of stuff that we see with particularly like the king cake around Mardi Gras or the Christmas pudding and so on, where things have got stuff baked into them, charms and so on, which we'll have a look at more next week when we do cakes and pies, but it bears investigation here. And it's the idea that whichever symbol you get in your piece confers some kind of divinatory purposes, and obviously in this case, if you got the cross, you got special blessings. And then finally, the idea of throwing the end slice of the loaf into the river to appease it, essentially, to stop it flooding, sort of feels like a hark back to a lot of the older river folklore where people would make some kind of sacrifice to the river to try and keep it happy. So I love the fact that in this one little snippet of folklore, we've got like 3 different things going on at the same time. There is also an interesting link between seafaring and hot cross buns, and this may then show that there's a slight grain of truth in the Widow's Son tale involving a sailor, because apparently women in Sunderland in particular, but also other areas around the coast, right around the British Isles as well, would send their husbands to sea with their Good Friday bread to avoid a shipwreck, particularly hot cross buns. And finally, if you want to cement a friendship for the coming year, then share a hot cross bun with the other person. And this explains the old rhyme, half for you and half for me, between us two good luck shall be, which I think is quite a nice little thing to do with hot cross buns. And it's funny, I used to hate hot cross buns when I was younger, and then one year I had some at work, weirdly enough, and I'd gotten them from M&S, and M&S hot cross buns are spectacular. And we had apple and cinnamon ones, and then we also had these weird chocolate and orange ones, and the chocolate and orange ones were fabulous. But then I kind of discovered, actually, no, I do quite like hot cross buns. I don't know why I thought I didn't, but you didn't need to know that. I just thought I'd throw it in. But anyway, what should we make of it all, from the widow's son tale all the way through to hot cross bun folklore? Well, like I say, we've got no way to know for definite whether the widow ever existed, much like the legend behind Mother Redcap up in Camden, who then gave her name to a pub as well. And while it's cool that the pub continues the tradition, it does kind of turn the story into like a little bit of local drama. I don't get the sense that it's necessarily for the benefit of tourists. It does very much seem to be something within the local community, which is really cool. And it is quite nice to see places keeping folklore traditions alive. So if they are still continuing it, then obviously that is really awesome. But perhaps the most fascinating thing about the whole legend is the way in which it preserves folklore about hot cross buns themselves. So their link with Good Friday becomes absolutely intrinsic to the tale, while their protective nature is then important to their suspension from the ceiling. So I do think it is quite interesting how a lot of the story wouldn't make sense without that hot cross bun folklore. So they do kind of feed into each other to make this wonderful tradition that keeps on going. And to be fair, London's full of this kind of stuff, so that makes it quite interesting as well. So I hope you enjoyed that episode. Do let me know if you do like hot cross buns. Let me know if you don't. I mean, I'm easy either way. There is a recipe that I found in an old book on my blog post for this particular episode. And it comes from a book from 1925. And there's a recipe. There's actually a few bread recipes on that particular page because it's public domain. And it's from the Good Bread Recipe book. So if you want to have a go at some 1925 style hot cross buns, then be my guest. There are obviously other recipes available. You tend to find them, loads of them, in April for obvious reasons. Next week, we're going to be having a look at cakes and pies, like I say, so I hope that you stick around for that one. And that would be really lovely to share that kind of folklore with you next week. Speaking of Easter, like I've said in the past couple of episodes, if you are in London on April the 11th, which is just after the Easter weekend, then I am doing my talk on water folklore in and around the British Isles, and it would be lovely to see you there for that as well. And other than that, yeah, I'll see you next week for the folklore of cakes and pies. And I will also be dropping the special interview with my fabulous guest nearer the time, which is also going to be about like food and folklore and fairy tales and so on. So I will see you next week and have a lovely time. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.